Forged secretly in mortuary archaeology's hottest furnace, it's Archaeodeath.
And welcome back to the Archaeodeath YouTube channel. Now, in the last 100 or so videos, I've explored all aspects of death and memory from heritage and archaeology perspectives, and after a bit of a hiatus because of work-related problems and some health issues, I'm back now, and I hope to move forward in coming months to share with you some more exciting research in the fields of archaeology of death and the archaeology of memory, but also some interviews with some of the leading experts in the field. So watch this space for future videos. Now, in this video, I'm going to basically share with you a pre-recorded lecture that I presented at the CBA, Council for British Archaeology, North West Region's Spring Conference. And this took place on Saturday, the 15th of May, 2021. And the conference theme was the archaeology taking place in the region in lockdown, but I presented on the archaeology of lockdown. And there's a broader context here of other projects by museums, heritage specialists and archaeologists exploring how our experience and engagement with landscape, monuments and material culture has shifted during the lockdown and afterwards. And I take my local region of North East Wales and the sort of parts of Cheshire and Merseyside I was able to get to as a case study for these broader ways in which archaeologists can investigate the archaeology of the lockdown itself, the material cultures, monuments and landscapes. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you have an opportunity to stay with me, subscribe and watch some of my future videos, as well as you can always jump back and see the sort of the back catalogue of things I've been presenting on.
Hello, I'm Professor Howard Williams and welcome to my talk on the archaeology of lockdown. And while I've addressed it on my Archaeodeath blog and in some of my YouTube videos and TikToks, aspects of the lockdown experience of archaeology and the relationship of archaeology to the COVID-19 pandemic global experience, I do want to sort of express my thanks to being given the opportunity to present to a rich and diverse audience sort of for the first time my broader thoughts on the archaeology of lockdown. Not simply archaeology in lockdown, although I will be addressing aspects of that, but archaeology of the lockdown itself. I'm sorry I can't do a live presentation. Just so much is going on in the world at the moment of my job and personal circumstances. It would have been just a mess trying to achieve that. So I've shared this video, but of course please get in touch by email, check out my blog, or look at my Twitter handle if you want to follow up with any of the issues that I explore in this presentation. Now, there's a lot of people been discussing in archaeology, heritage, and across other disciplines the nature of the lockdown, its context, circumstances, how it's been had taken place, the various different lockdowns in response to the COVID-19 global pandemic, and also the archaeology of lockdown. And things are moving slowly, and there are only a few publications out. But I wanted to sort of start by just saying that some broad statements of what I think is an archaeology of lockdown. Archaeology offers insights and perspectives on pandemics and catastrophes from the human past. We explore human societies, their adaptations to their environment and their socio-economic, political, ideological dimensions through the long term and over broad geographical breadths, as well as looking at local micro scales of interaction. So the responses to disease and catastrophes of other kinds are part of our remit, and so archaeology has a lot to offer in our reflections on the significance of the lockdown. And while I've seen a lot of people jumping to press quite quickly with their hot takes on the lockdown from the perspective of medieval plagues or classical catastrophes, or in the ancient world, or prehistoric times, I think some of that is headline grabbing and very much trying to centre ourselves as relevant. I think there are genuine contributions that archaeology makes in terms of its data, but also its theory and methods to those broader questions, perspectives and insights. But also, of course, archaeology and heritage are directly implicated into what's been going on. We've had to transform our policies and practices of how we do our jobs and how we engage communities in so many different ways through the lockdown, through our teaching, our research, our fieldwork, lab work, our desk-based work, working from home, our heritage management and conservation strategies, our public engagement, etc. There's nothing that hasn't been affected by the lockdown in one way or another. But those are different areas I'm not going to really cover. What I really wanted to think about was how do we actually investigate the pandemic itself as material culture perspectives with that landscape and long-term perspectives, those strings to our bow. Well, a range of archaeologists have already begun this job. Museums and commercial organisations and researchers creating sort of a digital ongoing archives as well as field practices to record aspects of the lockdown. So I really have to take my hat off and defer to others for the real exciting work in this area, and I've put some of the links here, including a recent paper by the brilliant John Schofield of the University of York on COVID waste, and not just with John, there's a range of other authors looking at the plastic pollution dimensions of the COVID pandemic. But my point is there's a lot of ongoing discussions and work taking place to say how can we archaeologically do a contemporary archaeology of the lockdown, how do we do an investigation of the material culture of the lockdown. And in that regard, I've already made some humble contributions on my ArchaeoDeath blog, and please do defer to that to have a look. I suppose some of the key issues for me for archaeology and heritage are that this has been a time of death and dying at an unprecedented scale, above the average, where the news and our consciousness of hygiene, health, dying in disease of all kinds is at the forefront. But it's also a time of social immobility, isolation, and access denial at various different levels, and internationally, globally, down to locally, people's access to sites, resources that they normally have access to. So it's a time of social, economic, and spiritual, as well as ideological shifts and conflicts. It's a time of tensions. It's also a time where, in many ways, the local and the digital engagement with our surroundings has been emphasised with the pandemics. We are locked in our homes or to our localities, and therefore the local, the real world but local, and the digital have an enhanced access for many of us. I'm not saying that applies everywhere, but I think that's a general point that's important, and that politics of identity, health, society, economy, and the environment are at the fore. There's many interleaving dimensions with the COVID pandemic, some of them direct, some of them indirect, with protests over women's safety, over Black Lives Matter. There's been a host of different interleaving ideas, and I can't encapsulate all of those things that have happened in 2020, 2021 in this protest. But we've seen the interaction of the pandemic in many different regards there. And this opens up new normals for archaeologies and heritages of life and of death. And I think a lot of the discussion I've seen has tended to forget mortality. This has been a time where funerals have stopped, where cemeteries and burial grounds have been closed, where access to those environments has been impeded, to normal procedures of dying, of terminal care, where hospices and care homes have been devastated by this, by the lack of, in many cases, policies and preparedness for the pandemic. So this is a time where there's new normals taking over, and there'll be new normals taking over from the new normals, and probably new normals. But in other words, there's no going back to a pre-COVID world. We're into a whole new ways of thinking about our landscape, environment, and material culture. So with that as context, I now want to pursue 6 themes. I'll try and do this relatively quickly and rapid fire, just to give you a flavour of what I'm talking about, although I think it'll be for another presentation to go into more depth. The first one, an archaeological perspective, can be to explore the rubbish and wear, the breakdowns and challenges of our society caused by the pandemic lockdowns. There's a whole host of issues here, as John Schofield et al. Have addressed regarding plastic pollution, but the breakdown of standard depositional practices, accesses to rubbish dumps, access to council service, rubbish pickups. We've seen littering, fly tipping, and a transformation of our landscapes. It's there's been clawback in many areas about this, but also the stickers here telling you about bin use. This bin will not be emptied, and there it is, full of plastic and all sorts. There's a dumpsters where people have just thrown stuff on top and packed full rubbish bins. people just leaving things they'd normally take to dumps by municipal bins, and of course the discard of specific items, including reusable and disposable face masks. So we have the archaeology of the pandemic through the discard, not simply items connected to the pandemic itself, the masks, but the broader challenges of our landscape in terms of the deposition at and around rubbish bins. And I suppose that people have perceived this in different ways, but certainly in my vicinity, in the Anglo-Welsh borders, I've seen almost at different times during the pandemic the most restricted access bins just being used as sort of nodes for deposition of all manner of material cultures, of all great and small kinds, and local lanes have been used for excessive fly tipping. Another aspect that we can see is wear of changing patterns of behaviour. This is in the drought of 2020. Well, it's quite a very dry summer, and a local playing field near me, and the volume of walking, of daily exercise routines restricted to local areas without driving, meant that this particular playground became almost bare around its perimeter from wear. So wear and repair is another trace of the pandemic lockdown. Now, I appreciate these are ephemeral archaeologies. They're not going to have a long-term trace, but they have an imprint on our experience and our lives living through 2020 and into 2021. My second point is regulatory material cultures. And these, again, are mainly temporary, but they are a key aspect of an archaeology of rules and regulation that we can explore for the lockdown. Some of these are to do with the body, the person, and this is me in a couple of selfies to illustrate that, and my university's pack of corporate face masks and bag and other bits and bobs to prepare me for the pandemic experience. Enough about that. But anyway, the point is that there is the individualization of those regulations in terms of abiding by mask wearing, as well as the cacophony, the proliferation, the melange of different icons and signage in our public spaces, here in cases to railway stations. This is not simply about signs, this is about transforming public space. This is queuing sites for local primary schools, and me standing on a dot in my primary school, my kids' playground, to make the point that the temporary traces of regulated spatial positioning, the 2-meter rule, has at least a temporary imprint on our spatial environment. And here you are for playgrounds and public country parks. You can see a range of different signage, different designs, temporary, the inept, such as those tied with string and completely illegible by a park. Here, sort of very, very vividly designed sets of do's and don'ts and colour schemes, symbols, supposedly showing things that it's often not clear whether these icons, like does that tell you cough and sneeze into your arm? I don't know. Some of them are more effective than others, shall we say. And also out in the broader landscape, footpaths, towpaths of canals, a whole host of different signage and letters, some of them adapting warning styles from pre-pandemic times, such as the red with white lettering, others almost like planning notifications from a council, various different styles and designs depending on which organisation, and also various different attempts to stylize the human body, which is very interesting, and most of which are, again, adapted from standard signage, but some of them quite elaborate stylizations of what humans supposedly look like, which is interesting, shall we say. If that is indeed 2 meters, those are very small individuals. But also there's gender neutral versions, and then attempts to show the standard toilet door stylizations for a woman and a man. A fascinating rich vein of archaeological inquiry, and also attempts at semi-humorously putting this into practice through other material cultures, animal bodies and objects used to articulate the need to keep social distancing regulations during the pandemic. So these are the Clwydian Range and Dee Valley AONB attempts, which I think are great. my own university's efforts with a colour scheme and arrows, and yes, interesting. I went to IKEA once in a year, and just to make the point, on escalators, and faded already from footfall outside IKEA in Warrington, just to make the point that these are ephemeral, but they have proliferated throughout our public spaces in so many varieties that we are now encoded into recognising them, and I think they will have a semi-enduring impact on people's behaviour moving forward. But it's not simply about maintaining regulations of social distancing and other hygiene regulations. It's also about businesses attempting to promote that they're still working at times where businesses are being under threat. So here's a Toyota garage trying to make a good news story of supporting the NHS and keeping their signage connected to why they are still working. And we've had individual businesses doing their own versions. This is the Cambridge Hotel near Llangollen with its own signage. Everyone's got their own version of it. But also we've seen children's agency involved in creating makeshift signage. This was early in the pandemic, where there was a lot of focus on transmission via touch rather than airborne. And here on a dual carriageways footbridge, we've got some sort of makeshift signs saying "Do not hold railing, Corona safe," I think that is. And of course, heritage sites closing down, signage to make it more difficult to access, new anti-spike fencing put at Valley Crucis, closed signs at Clegurley, and this is the National Trust property of Erddig. So we've seen this proliferation of contemporary signage, and this goes from outdoors but also indoors. And these are some toilets at a heritage site in South Wales, which I happened to be visiting, and I thought was worthy of recording. No one else was in there at the time, I assure you, but I thought this hazard tape is another dimension worthy of mention, the blocking off of spaces to maintain indoor social distances. So those are two aspects I wanted to address. But there are more and more that link to my interest in death and memory. Emotive material cultures have proliferated too in our landscapes, not only in terms of people's front gardens, walls, flags, windowed displays, boards of all kinds, chalk, but also in other public places, schools, playgrounds, walls, expressing gratitude, an archaeology of gratitude for the NHS and for key workers during the lockdown period. So positive expressions of the rainbow symbols and the thank you NHS signs. This is outside an old people's home, a sort of a mosaic, semi-permanent attempt. So you get this sort of sense of almost art rather than graffiti, of various different types embroidered. And of course, COVID snakes have been a very distinctive phenomenon. This is the Alan Waters COVID-19 snake, and his name is I'm Alan the snake, or she, I don't know. Alan should be a female name, really, shouldn't it? It's a river. And there's the snake wending its way through the summer of 2020, and it's now repositioned in the island in the centre of the car park at Alan Waters Country Park, and each individual stone painted by local schools or local individuals to augment this collective expression of thanks, a collective experience, an emotional outpouring. This is outside Gresford Primary School, so like a school-based COVID snake running along the opposite the churchyard at Gresford and along the wall, and also at Moss Valley here, a shrine, a sort of a thank you shrine. This is key workers stay safe, thank you post workers, not just the NHS but a range of key workers. So this landscapes of gratitude through temporary shrines, and this one is good because it shows you the ephemerality, because this is in the summer of 2020, this was a month and a half ago in 2021, to show you how they do have a trace. And I don't think anyone's going to actively destroy this, but it's going to be faded, it will fall apart, there's a steep slope, maybe a few local kids will trash it, but the point is this does have a semi-permanent status in the landscape, this broken tree used as a sort of three-dimensional space to create a shrine. And religious spaces too have had their thank you signs up. So my third area of the archaeology of lockdown is emotive or gratitude material cultures. A fourth point is lockdown landscapes. Now this could be a whole talk in itself, but of course my point would be that pre-existing locked down abandoned spaces take on a new sort of almost like a new power in the lockdown era. So abandoned vehicles, houses, chapels, business and shopping areas take on a new, almost foreshadowing of the lockdown that took place through 2020 and 2021. And I don't think that's easily articulated or rationalized, but I have blogged about how I think this adds a new dimension, that the abandoned places suddenly gain more prominence when we're dealing with other kinds of lockdown. And I use this particular Wrexham pub as an example because it links to a theme I can't address here on the colonial countryside and colonialism, and in response and reflections on colonialism in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. But this pub is just one example of course, how our towns, villages, and cities have seen shutdowns, and we've seen chains and individual businesses go under. So the shutdown of businesses is another aspect of the archaeology of the lockdown. This alpaca is just simply to make the point that the lockdown has meant we experience our local landscapes in a different way. Places we may never been before suddenly have come to prominence, and that's true for me and my family because we got to meet these alpacas that we hadn't met before by exploring a different walking route. And I think that's really important, as well as those global changes of shut down businesses, lockdown landscapes. There's also those local experiences that have changed. Local heritage and experience of the environment, historic environment, has shifted because of the lockdown. I wouldn't say this is an example of explicitly lockdown resistance, but we also have to think of the spaces where people try and get away from the rules, try and get out and about, and I think this is can be described as one such example. Some makeshift drinking place for local youth, I imagine, on the edge of a park in a discreet location, and I think the landscape has become littered with these more prominently than before, as people find places that are sort of out of audio and visual sight of everyone else, so that they can practice some public social interaction away from the eyes of people who would judge them, and the lockdown sort of rules might be flaunted. And we've also seen lockdown reflected in contested heritage, such as here with the Sarah Everard vigil that went so violently wrong with police intervention in March. So this is the Historic England bandstand, Grade 2 listed bandstand. This is the very peaceful vigil of women and men, but mainly women protesting against in response to the murder of Sarah Everard and the violence that then ensued. And I'm just making the point that the lockdown, this isn't particularly just about the lockdown, but the pandemic regulation of the lockdown gave authorities the excuse to move in on this peaceful protest in a way that wouldn't have been allowed before, and make arrests for their own safety. And it creates a new discourse in our politics. Now, there's two further areas that I don't have time to go into in any depth, but I just want to briefly mention. In my blogs and my writings, I've also talked about lockdown borderlands, because obviously I have an interest in Offa's Dyke, an 8th century linear earthwork and Britain's longest, and there it is in two different scales of survival. And Watts Dyke, another linear earthworks in the Anglo-Welsh borders, and here's Watts Dyke running through Wrexham Cemetery, sites that sometimes go past unnoticed, even despite being massive monuments, and some places where they are picked out on heritage interpretation. As here, as part of the Offa's Dyke Collaboratory, we've worked to create a range of digital resources before the lockdown, and a collective research energy to move forward investigations of these ancient borderlands and linear frontier monuments, social media. And at the very beginning of the lockdown, I think it was me that created perhaps one of the first public events during the lockdown. So we had to rearrange this day event. So it was going to be a public conference and walking tour to be all digital, with a digital tour supported by ArchaeoSoup. Thank you, Mark. And I had a really great day with hundreds of people engaging with the online lectures through YouTube and social media, and with the virtual tour that I did, the Tragical History Tour of Trevonnan in Shropshire. And so that's an example of practice adapting to the lockdown. We've got a digital online journal that's ongoing and has become a lockdown product, edited by Liam Delaney and myself. And we produced the first volume before the lockdown, but volume 2 is a lockdown product, and volume 3 is going to be coming through soon. But of course, the lockdown had an effect on borders and the politics of borders as well, and that's an area we can see in the mobilisation of these ancient linear earthworks in 21st century politics during the last year, and particularly with Welsh and English nationalisms and local divisions coming to the fore in attitudes and responses to the pandemic. Rebuild Offa's Dyke, not simply in the sense of a political border between the English and the Welsh, but a militarised border to defend against English tourists, against Welsh travellers, depending on which stage of the lockdown we're talking about and whether England or Wales had the more severe rules. So we see the border becoming a contested territory digitally and physically during this time, and used across the political spectrum as a football in the political discourse. And my response to that has been to intervene in sense of pointing out that Offa's Dyke and Watts Dyke were never really the Anglo-Welsh border. That's an anachronism, and to point out what these monuments might have been instead, and also to write about this for BBC Travel and to appear on the ITV programme Wonders of the Border. And I did that work because I wanted to counter some of the nationalistic myths from both an English and a Welsh perspective about these ancient monuments in what is now the Anglo-Welsh borderland. And my final point is I intervened on the topic of lockdown, death and memory. And there's a whole host of issues I can talk about here to do with the fact that obviously death and burial and funerals were curtailed, churches and places of worship were closed, cemeteries in the first lockdown were locked. And this, I made the point that while we need to maintain social distancing, this was a foolish gesture that did not consider the full range in which deathscapes of all kinds, churchyards, cemeteries, crematoria, gardens of remembrance, have important roles for rest, exercise, education, as well as mourning, commemoration, worship and reflection. And so these were spaces that were being curtailed, particularly for urban populations that I would suggest needn't have been. But the pandemic response to mourning and loss can be seen throughout our landscape. So that we can see that on sort of trees. This is a mast tied as a memorial as part of a long-term hawthorn tree memorial site. War memorials. This is in Flintshire. A war memorial adapted as a COVID memorial or a gratitude shrine with painted pebbles and painted bales. Interesting there. Churchyards. This is Hope Churchyard with its NHS flag trumping the Union flag, and thank you to key workers symbols. And these spaces have, for the second and subsequent lockdowns, remained open and spaces of at least partial access, even if funerals aren't taking place at them. So we do have a discussion here about the signage, the regulations. Here's Margam Crematorium, where a whole series of signs and bollards and blocking off of benches to stop people breaking accidentally social distance gatherings. We can see a sort of temporary archaeologies of COVID affecting the spaces of our dying, death, burial, cremation and commemoration. And it does bring to the fore the whole relationship of digital versus material death as we move forward through the 21st century. Conversations that have been long going in archaeology has an important role to contribute to, but where we see this coming to the fore in this COVID world. And I feel that my ArchaeoDeath blog, while it wasn't designed for COVID, did a job in reflecting on mortality and archaeology and mortality in a digital environment through the pandemic. And it's been a very popular resource discussing sites people can't access, but also themes that I think are particularly pertinent in this time of the global pandemic. And I think even reflecting on The Dig, the Netflix film The Dig from the earliest part of this year, was very much, it wasn't intended and made as a pandemic film, but I think the reflections of mortality within that film, as discussed in my blog, do pertain to the COVID experience in many touching ways, thinking about past and the importance of the past and the importance of memory and mortality for 21st century audiences, reflecting on the a fictional rendition of the excavation of Mound 1 at Sutton Hoo in 1939. So lockdown conclusions for you. Well, the pandemic has profoundly affected lifeways and deathways. There's no denying that. And this is a very personal exploration from an archaeologist of the lockdown. And I've identified a series of interconnected themes. And I confess there are many others I haven't gone into. We can look at archaeology can offer material and temporal perspectives on pandemics. Archaeologists' work has been transformed by the pandemic, certainly, and I could talk all about that. But I would also contend that archaeologists can study the lockdown itself and be active and critical expert voices in key pandemic debates regarding health, politics, society, and economy during, and I would propose after, the pandemic. So there's a host of untapped potential themes spanning digital and real-world material cultures and landscapes to explore about the pandemic and about archaeologists' role in talking about society, how we live, how we use our historic environments, how we access that environment, and how we deal with death, dying, and bereavement and commemoration. Thank you very much.
Sadly, we're all going to die. But while you're waiting, why not follow Archaeodeath? Subscribe now on YouTube.